Idi Amin was the military dictator of Uganda from 1971 to 1979. And his reign is remembered as one of the most brutal and most unpredictable in modern African history. Before he became president, he was the high-ranking officer in the Uganda army, and what many do not know, he was also a former heavyweight boxing champion. He seized power in military coup while the previous president was away for a meeting. He promised to bring order and democracy back to the country. However, he quickly changed from a soldier who was popular with his troops into a ruler who used extreme violence to stay in power. Amin's leadership was characterized by, strange behavior and a series of shocking decisions. He gave himself exaggerated titles, and eventually calling himself the conqueror of the British Empire and the last king of Scotland. But despite these strange titles, his actions were deadly serious. And in 1972, he ordered tens of thousands of people of South Asian descent, to leave Uganda within 19 days. Claiming he wanted to give the economy back to black Ugandans. This decision caused the country's economy to collapse because many of those white descent who were forced to leave the country were business owners, and they were doctors, so they were important people that kept the country running. The most terrifying part of Idi Amin's rule was actually his use of death squads to eliminate anyone who he perceived as a threat. It is estimated that between 100,000 and 500,000 people were killed during his 8 years in power. He targeted judges, religious leaders, journalists, and even his own government ministers. That's how brutal he was. Because he was so afraid, he constantly changed his location and lived in fear of being overthrown. His cruelty wasn't just limited to his enemies. He was known for being erratic and would often make life and death decisions based on his moods. Even if he had a dream. That's how bizarre he was. Idi Amin's downfall finally came in 1979. After he attempted to invade the neighboring country of Tanzania. The Tanzania army, joined by Uganda rebels who had fled his rule, they fought back and marched all the way to Uganda's capital, which is Kampala. Idi Amin fled the country and eventually settled in Saudi Arabia. That's where he lived, in exile until his death in 2003. Idi Amin was never really put on trial for his crimes, but he remains a symbol of how a leader can use charisma and military might to cause immense suffering and damage to an entire nation. So tell me what you think about Idi Amin and his impacts in Uganda, and don't forget to watch out for more exciting videos like this. See ya.